Well, good morning, church. It's great to be together. We want to say welcome to the warehouse. It was great to just see you guys beginning to gather there this morning. Hopefully you're having a great time over there at the fire hall. It's good to be with you. And of course, we want to say welcome to the table as you guys engage in your second week of this experiment. And we welcome you into this space. And it's just good to be together here at the factory. And anybody that's online or watching in, maybe you're at a coffee shop or out on holidays, it's just good to be together as a church this weekend. We're going to do the same thing as we did last week, and I'm going to get you into teams, and we're going to have a little bit of a challenge together. So you need to find 3 or 4 people around you, grab a group, make yourselves known to each other. If you just want to sit there, you can ignore everybody around you, no problem. But get into teams, okay? If you're at the table, you've already got your teams around your table. And we're going to play a little game together called What's the Difference? Okay, what's the difference? So I'm going to begin with giving you a couple of words, and you're going to decide what the difference is between them, and then I'll give you the answers, and we'll see how you did. So the first one I think should be relatively easy. Here you go. What's the difference between cement and concrete? Go. Cement and concrete. All right. I hope you've got your answers together. Here's what we've got. So cement is a powder that's made with calcified lime and clay. When you add water, it hardens. But concrete is actually a mixture of cement with crushed stone, rock, sand, and water. And so concrete is what we walk on that's been mixed. Cement is used to make concrete. Okay, how you doing? 1 for 1, anybody? Okay, we got a few out there. Okay, next one. We'll get a little harder here. What's the difference between a sphinx and a sphinx? One has a Y and one has an I, okay? You got to decide where you're at on this. Go. All right, hopefully you've got your answers over there at the warehouse and the fire hall. Here's what we've got. So a sphinx with an eye is a mythical creature who has the head of a human and the body of a lion. We see these in the pyramids. A sphinx with a Y is a hairless cat, one of the ugliest creatures on the planet. Anybody have a hairless cat? Sorry if I've offended you. They're beautiful, lovely, I'm sure. It's got a great personality. Okay. Next, we've got what's the difference between an emoji and an emoticon? All right, if you've got some youthfulness around you, this might help your case. Go for it. All right. So here's what we've got. An emoji is a digital image that's used to express an emotion. An emoticon is using your type and your text to display a facial expression. Anybody get that one? Well, we got a few out there. Hopefully over at the warehouse you got some sorted. Okay, last one. We're going to get a little more churchy here. What's the difference between faith and faithfulness? Faith and faithfulness. Go. It's a little quieter on this one, a little quieter. That's okay. What's the difference? When you think of faith or faithfulness, what's the difference? One word's longer. That's good over here. Yeah. Fantastic. All right, as we gather back in, thanks for playing along. And as we dig in, we are finishing off this week, the book of James, actually yesterday, and this last week on our chapter a day, we have journeyed our way through this book of James. And this was a letter written by James to the Christians that were dispersed around the area. It was written in the 50s. like in the actual 50s. And so this was not long after Jesus had departed from the earth, and we read all about what was happening in the book of Acts. The church was exploding, and people were coming to this new faith, and this church was just growing, and yet then all of a sudden there was some threats to kind of the kingdom that was at play there, and so they began to persecute, and it was a hostile environment, and so all of these new churches and new Christians just were scattered all over because of the threat of persecution. And so James writes his letter, and he says, this is a letter to all those Christians who have been dispersed around from Jerusalem. Now, we understand James is the brother of Jesus, and so all the evidence we have is that while Jesus was on earth doing his ministry and walking around, James did not think of his brother as the Son of God. It's not surprising, I don't think, because most brothers don't think of each other as deities, do they? So they certainly don't in my household. And not only that, but we have an instance in the Gospels where we read about Jesus' brothers and sisters showing up and actually seizing Jesus, taking him away because they thought he had lost his mind. But I guess here's what convinces you that your brother is a god is you die, you stay that way for a few days, and then you show back up and cook some fish with him. That'll do it for you. So this James literally had an experience where he realized, oh my goodness, this is who this man was. This is who my brother was. And then he devotes his life to the birthing and the growth of the church. And so this letter would have been written by James. He wrote it to those Christians that were scattered around. And the churches that would have received this letter, they would have been received by a runner. So James would have distributed this letter with a runner, and he would have gone from town to town. When he knew there was a church in that town, he'd show up with this letter, he'd deliver it. The church would then gather together. I mean, it would not look much like this. They'd be much smaller, probably in a house together. They'd gather and share a meal, and then one of the leaders or the elders would open up this letter and would read it in one sitting as they gathered together. He wouldn't say, hey, listen, everybody open up your copy of the letter that James wrote, and we'll read the first sentence, and then for 30 minutes we're going to talk about that sentence. It's not how it worked for them. Hopefully, as you read through James this past week, you were able to take these words in such a way where we read them and get a sense that James was going pretty hard at addressing a lot of issues that he was seeing, a lot of issues he felt were pervasive in the church, and he doesn't hold back. There's a medical theory referred to as Occam's razor. And Occam's razor states the simplest explanation is preferable to the one that is more complex. So in medical practice, the theory of Occam's razor implies that even though you might see a variety of symptoms, a diagnosis should begin with exploring a single cause, a simple cause to them all. When we read James, kind of feels like we're at a doctor's office, a visit to the doctor's office, and he's listing symptom after symptom after symptom of what he's seeing in the church. And he's identifying these. He's writing to Jesus followers who are scattered around to figure out how they should be living their faith in the context of the world around them. And James jumps around exposing and identifying all sorts of issues. He says, your words that you're using are harsh. Your anger is just too prominent in your life. You're becoming judgmental. He says, you're discriminating against each other based on appearances or status. You're playing favorites. You're showing partiality. Your arrogance is just so prominent. And you're envious and you're caught up in wealth. And James is kind of like the doctor who goes and sees all of these symptoms and essentially boils it down into a simple explanation. If there's one thing as we read through the book of James that he is calling out, it is hypocrisy. You claim to have faith, James says, but where is it? I cannot see it. You are virtually indistinguishable from the world around you. You speak as though you were devoted followers of Jesus, and yet it is making no difference in your life. I mean, listen to some of the words that James speaks. He says, listen, you readily accept my mercy, but you don't extend it to each other. You listen and ingest all of this teaching. You study scriptures, and yet you're like somebody that looks in a mirror and 10 seconds later, you forget what you look like. As soon as you step away, you forget all of these things. You still remain judgmental and reactive and selfish, James says. He says to his readers, you claim to embrace the gospel that is open to all and invite all, and yet you discriminate as people come into your gatherings based on their appearances or based on their status. You treat people with favoritism. People that will benefit you, you treat with more value. You value others based on what value they can give back to you. He says you readily accept God's mercy and grace extended to you, and yet you're so quick to judge each other. In chapter 3, he says, with the very same tongue you gather and you sing praises and you admire God together. And then with that same tongue you turn around and you tear your brother or your sister down who has been made in the likeness of God. You claim to follow God, but you are immersed in the world around you. You claim that you've surrendered and you depend on God, and yet you're unwilling to relinquish control and include God in your plans. James hits hard on a lot of issues. I'd venture to say that in 2,000 years, the context surely has changed, but the issues really haven't. And he exposes the baseline issue in which their words and their sentiments are not aligning with their actions. And then it's not translating into their actual day-to-day lives. Hypocrisy seems to be the dominant script that they carry. And we return to our little game that we played together earlier, and I asked you what's the difference between faith and faithfulness? Two terms that we understand differently often. Words that are central to the writing of the book of James. In fact, it's really what James is known to address. This book is known to describe the divide that we find between faith and action. In our game, I wonder what came out for you as we distinguished between these two words. Faith, you might have said, faith is belief. Faith is trust. Faith is maybe a choice, or it's something that we have, or it's an emotion that we feel. Maybe faith is the absence of doubt. But when we talk about faithfulness, what is that? It has much more to do with our actions, doesn't it? Faithfulness has much more with what we're doing over time of remaining faithful, fidelity. It has to do with our allegiances staying strong. And yet here lies the problem. In the Greek language, faith and faithfulness are the exact same word. It's not like we have a same word that has two different meanings either. It's that both meanings are fully embodied in a singular idea. It's the Greek word pistis, and it's all throughout James. In fact, it's all throughout the New Testament, and so often it's translated in a few different words, and for us, we stumble over this because we have different meanings attached to them. Pistis is a singular Greek term that embodies a wide variety of English concepts. It has no English equivalent for us to use. Primarily, it's either been translated as faith or belief, and sometimes as faithfulness, but also sometimes as trust or fidelity. The reality is that pistis embodies all of these concepts. And when we translate it, we've had to attempt to figure out which of these words to best use in any given situation. But the reality is, whenever we make a choice to one of these words, it's almost never able to convey the full meaning it would have carried in its original language when it was heard. And so that choice can sometimes have a major impact on our understanding of the concept of faith. Faith or faithfulness. The understanding we carry isn't a simple debate of semantics. It actually has implications for us that lead us to some underlying problems in our understanding of what it means to have pistis, what it means to be people of faith. The choice or the bias of using one of these words over the other creates some foundational questions for us. The reality is that as we begin to understand the Greek usage of pistis, a picture emerges seeing these two words, faith and faithfulness, not as a choice of which one is correct, but actually as two concepts together as one reality, two sides of the very same coin. But some questions arise for us. You see, the very concept of our salvation is embodied in this word pistis. We have hinged our view often of salvation on a singular moment of pistis, of faith. We speak of belief or trust. But a problem arises if we hinge it on faithfulness. Because now it feels like we're beginning to say our salvation is earned, or it's something that we earn as an acceptance with God. When we understand having faith for something, we often embody this as an emotion. But faithfulness isn't really an emotion at all. It's only found in action. Of most significance to me is the way that we have subtly segregated the notion of allegiance from the act of faith. And I think this has become a very dangerous experience for us in our modern understanding of faith. In fact, it's this segregation that can leave us comfortable and confident, simply affiliating ourselves, carrying the label of Christians, and yet blatantly ignoring all of the ways in which it is making no noticeable difference in our lives. And this is exactly what James was confronting when he wrote this letter. It leaves us in some discomfort and with some questions if we truly take the weight of his words. But these questions are important and they're legitimate. But the very questions it leaves us with actually expose some of our deficiencies in how it is that we understand the gospel or Scripture. We desire control. We desire conclusive, black and white, compartmentalized theology that feels like we have control over. That we can organize, that keeps us sort of in the driver's seat, that keeps us in the place where we feel like we can manage it all. This also existed in the early church as well. I mean, how often did Jesus rail into this when he walked the earth? The religious leaders that rubbed shoulders with Jesus were constantly feeling challenged and panicked and offended and felt like they were losing their grip on the control of how it was that they were achieving their status with God. They had this formulaic approach to their faith. It made it predictable and controllable for them. And Jesus was just constantly lobbing grenades into their compartmentalized, organized, regimented version of faith that was essentially a breeding ground for judgmentalism and arrogance and superiority, all the while leaving them able to neglect the poor and the vulnerable and the discriminated peoples of their time. And I think we need to ask ourselves, how much do we reflect that? You see, James is a book about exposing these hypocrisies, about addressing the gap that exists between our faith and our faithfulness, where we claim to be followers of Jesus, people of pistis, people of demonstrating faithful allegiance to following his ways, and yet it seems to be much more of a label that we wear. So understanding this, I'd like to turn to the second chapter of James and the second half of that as well. And for the remainder of our time, see exactly what James was speaking through this. If you've got your Bibles, you can open up to James chapter 2. It'll also be on the screen. Right now, in the eyes of my 5-year-old daughter, Maggie, I am known as a man of no action. You see, let me tell you a story. Earlier this week, we were driving home. I had picked all the kids up from school. We got 4 kids, and I've got a tiny little 1992 Dodge Dynasty. It's a great little car, but I packed them all in, and it's a great car because it still has that middle seat in the front that has a seat belt. And so when I pick them all up, if I put 3 of them in the back, it's not a good situation because it's so tight and there's always fighting and they're hungry and school's over, so it's just not a good situation. So I often will bring Maggie, our 5-year-old, into that middle seat in the front. And it's great. So we've got 3 of us in this little car in the front, and it's sort of a throwback experience, right? So we're driving home, and it's sort of quiet in the car, and then all of a sudden, Maggie, right beside me, just starts spouting out this incredible vision that she has. She just talked about this fantastical idea about building a fort at home. Now, we build forts all the time, and it's a good experience for us. We have fun, but all I was trying to do is keep up with what she was explaining. I mean, it was unbelievable, this imagination that had erupted. And for a moment, I stopped her and I said, hey, where did you get this idea from? Is this from a movie or what? She was explaining all this. She said, no, I had a dream last night. I mean, it was amazing. And she begins to just explain this idea for a fort she wants to build with so much detail. And I was just sort of taken aback by this. But I decided in the moment when she was doing this to say, you know what, I'm going to have a little bit of fun as a dad here, and I'm just going to let this be entertained. So I started probing and asking questions, and she explained all of these details, and it was just amazing. And as I looked around, the other kids kind of picked up on what I was doing. And they started smirking because they could see that I was willing to entertain this as if it somehow was a feasible idea. And then she stops after explaining all. She says, okay, let's build it tonight. I'm like, whoa, okay, hold on. And so I just stepped back and I said, this is a pretty big deal, Maggie. Like, let's take a minute. I still need to understand some pieces. So maybe when we get home, you can draw me a picture of it. See what you're thinking. I thought, well, okay, we'll have some craft time and this idea will blow over and it'll all be a fun experiment. We got home and she went straight to the paper and she did. She drew it for me. So she comes up with this. Now, this might not look like a whole lot on there, but she went through every piece of this and explained it in detail. Each of these is the different rooms of the house, and she had it all mapped out. It was really, really quite spectacular how her imagination came up with this. So now, I've clearly got some problems for myself. And I'm in the middle of this parental experiment. It's actually real time. So if you've got any ideas at all, come and see me after the service. But her vision just has all sorts. All of the fort is built up on the ceiling, and you can go around to every piece of the room, into the basement and everything. It's just beautiful. But now I got to figure out, what am I going to do with this? But presently, to Maggie, I'm known as somebody with a lot of words, maybe even some enthusiasm, but really no action at all. Every day, Dad, when are we going to do this? Dad, what are we going to do? When are we going to build the fort? And I just have no action to prove it. James chapter 2, as he wrote this, is writing the very same sentiment to his readers. He's saying, listen, you're full of words, you're full of sentiment, you're full maybe even of enthusiasm, but there is no action. Let us read together from verse 14 to verse 26. It says this, what good is it, James says, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds, has no action? Can such a faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you goes to them and says, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it, he says? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have deeds. And James says, show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. You believe that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that, and they shudder. You foolish person. Do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And Scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God. That word believe is pistis. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And he was called God's friend. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit, as the body without breath is dead, so faith without deeds is dead, James says. Now, I'm not sure if this passage is familiar to you. Chances are, if you've been in a church context for any period of your life, you've probably heard these words before. And it's a very popular sort of sermon that arises from these words. In fact, if you kind of Google this section, you'll find the same 3-point sermon that arises that is just widely given. And it would look like this. James outlines the 3 different types of faith that there are. The first 3 verses show us that there's a dead faith. There's a faith that's absolutely dead and useless. These are those that call themselves Christians, but their faith is dead. It's not real. And so we can look around at all around us and say, hey, here's those types of Christians, those types of people that claim to be a Christian, but we can clearly see that's not happening based on what we're seeing in their lives. And then you go on to the next 2 verses and talk about a cerebral faith or maybe even an emotional faith. And he'd say, listen, there's dead faith, but then he takes it a step further. He says, even the demons believe, even the demons have faith, pistis. It's not just enough to have it up here. It's not just enough to even have an emotional experience, he would say. And then he'd move on to the last part of the chapter, and we'd say, listen, we need to talk about real faith, about dynamic faith, where our faith moves from up here down to our hearts, and it comes out in our actions, and that's real faith. And while this might be somewhat of a helpful framework for us to understand, and it certainly presents a compelling 3-point message, I think it somewhat limits the response, and it really loses some of the depth of what James is trying to say. I think we actually mute and we take away from some of the weight of what James is giving to us. And please don't hear me. I'm not saying that everybody before me has gotten this wrong and has been teaching heresy and suddenly I'm figured it out. I'm just implying that. Just kidding. But I think there remains this inherent danger when we try to categorize James' challenge to us. It seems to move us to boil things down to the question of measuring the legitimacy of our belief or of measuring the legitimacy of our trust. And I think it kind of results in one of 2 responses. The first would be, hey, I'm glad that's not me. I know that I'm a Christian, and I know I've got enough good stuff in my life to feel comfortable in that. So these verses are not for me. But, boy, they sure are for him over there. He's not doing anything, and they sure are for her. I can clearly see in her life that her faith's not real. Or maybe a second response that it gives is the actual polar opposite of that says, oh my goodness, do I have enough good deeds to know that I have real faith? I gave my life to Christ, but maybe I'm not doing enough to make it real. And so it leaves us in this panic. And I think both of those are unhealthy responses to what James is putting forth. The first is complacency, and it encourages a posture of judgmentalism and arrogance. But the second presents an unhealthy questioning of our value and worth and acceptance to God. And then the real heart of the message James gives is missed completely. Part of the danger is that both of these responses focus more on measuring the sincerity of a moment, a singular pistis moment, a moment of faith. Rather than understanding our pistis, our faith is more about an ongoing and active allegiance to a living God. James is trying to remind his readers that pistis, that faith, is not an in or out category, as much as it is embodied in this idea of putting our allegiance, our faithfulness, our ongoing allegiance, and choosing to follow Jesus. And that choosing to follow Jesus should, this is revolutionary. Choosing to follow Jesus should actually look like following Jesus. This is what James says. Now I want to pause for a moment at the table as you guys gather around your tables, and we're going to release you over to your hosts, and you're going to take some time to just answer some questions and to engage in some conversation. And here we will continue on. Let us continue to sift through these words that James gives us and to draw a few things from them together in chapter 2. James begins by telling us that mere belief or mere words are useless. They are just sentiment apart from any action in the real world of our lives. In verse 14, he says this, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds, is not active at all? Can such a faith save them?" James says. Many have struggled with these words. What do they mean? What are the implications for us? The question for sure makes us uncomfortable if we actually engage in it. And I'm not going to alleviate that. I'm going to proceed to say, here's the example that he gives, and let's take a look at this picture. He goes on to say in verse 15, he says, "Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food." I mean, this is an individual that has systemic poverty, daily not being able to eat, is not able to clothe themselves. So he says, suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, "Go in peace and keep warm and be well fed," and you do nothing about their physical needs, what good is it, James says? In the same way, faith, pistis by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. James exposes our tendencies to feel like we have participated in something, that we have somehow acted on something, and yet is just simply mere sentiment. To have an emotional experience is to feel like we've acted on something, and yet it remains just sentiment. They are words that might well be well-meaning, and yet they have no value. How often do we feel like we've talked about or engaged with an issue and done something about it when we simply share a post online, or we hang our hats on a position, or we read about it, or we jump on a bandwagon of reaction or sentiment? But the truth is, these are all empty words. If it doesn't meet any needs, if it's not productive, if it's not coming out in our action, he says it's as useless as telling a hungry and naked man to be warm and well fed and then just walking away. If I can share something that's been a learning for me over the years of being involved in the support programming that we do here in the neighborhood, it would be this. It's been my experience that those that we encounter, those that come through our doors, those that come and reach out for help, they almost always have a story to share about how they have heard of the sentiment of our faith, how they have heard of the words of it. Most have understood or heard the story of the gospel presented to them. It's been given in some form throughout their lives. But as we sit with these people over time, as we engage with them and we discover their greater story, it's become clear to me that though they have heard it, most have never experienced it. Most have never felt the experience of us living out the action of the gospel to their need. In their sometimes desperate need, they have often been given sentiment and well-meaning words, but they've not experienced a gospel that reenacts what Christ did for us when he walked into our pain and our need and our brokenness. To actually step in to their pain, to sit with them in their struggle or in their poverty, and to take action on their behalf. And the privilege that we have is that when we move from sentiment into action, we actually get to invite them to experience the gospel of God's mercy and compassion in a way that they can trust. When a woman reaches out and calls us or knocks on our door in fear, broken and under the impact and effect of domestic violence, which is common for us, what she needs is not another rendition of words, not some sentiment that are meaningless outside of action. What she needs is to experience the gritty and tangible gospel that Jesus himself demonstrated when he walked with the vulnerable here on earth. She needs somebody to be present and to enter into the chaos with her. She needs somebody that cares enough to form a practical safety plan for her. She needs somebody that can absorb and listen to the stories of her pain. She needs somebody that will provide a safe space for her children while she connects with others going through the same thing. And she needs somebody that is willing to accompany her in a courageous step to go to court, to do something that feels overwhelming. That is what action looks like. When one of our neighbors reaches out, struggling to feed their children and feeling the risk of eviction in their world and struggling to find work, the last thing that's needed is what James says in this picture. Sentiment. Hey, I really hope things work out for you. No. But what do I know? I know that it costs us to move into the middle of their struggle. It takes sacrifice to get eye to eye and face to face with these needs and to take action on their behalf. You see, these are complex issues. And the truth is that taking action is very difficult. And it costs us. It costs our time. It's risky. It often feels messy. And sometimes even feels unresolved. But I fear that the church can sometimes use prayer and spiritual well-wishing to be ignorant and complacent and lazy. And let us not let spiritual sentiment get into the way of the work of the actual kingdom of God. I find it compelling that James chooses an example like this to demonstrate his point. For James, the action of our faith is inextricably linked to how we respond to the vulnerable and the needs around us. Just a few verses earlier, James says at the end of chapter 1, he says, listen, you want to know what kind of religion that God accepts? He says, religion that God accepts is as pure and faultless as this, to look after the orphans and the widows in their distress and to keep yourself from being polluted by the world. You see, it's not found in sort of a well-organized theological position or sentiment. Faith, pistis, faithfulness puts us into the spaces in our world where we encounter each other, where we encounter the needs and the vulnerabilities of each other. And when we look eye to eye in these things, into the needs and the pain and the hurts of one another, we have to then confront our own arrogance. We have to then confront our own judgmentalism or our own anger where we are exposed. And we recognize that in our claim to have received God's mercy, we are often reluctant to extend it. Faith and faithfulness, allegiance to Jesus is a call to us to move into these spaces. And if it is not, we have to ask ourselves, where and how are we actually following Jesus? James is not vague on this in his letter. To speak of mercy and to not extend it to others is hypocrisy, he says. It is a pistis, it is a faith that is dead and worthless. To speak of compassion and receiving compassion from God and yet to do nothing for the needs around us, it's pistis that is empty and worthless. For us to gather and to sing praise to God with our tongues, this same instrument that we turn and we speak down to another person and deny the very image of God in them, he says, is hypocrisy. To readily accept God's forgiveness and grace in our lives and then to give space in our hearts for resentment and anger and unforgiveness and hostility towards each other. He says it's like looking in a mirror and walking away and forgetting what you've seen. James could not be more blunt. He says, what good is it? All the reading and teaching and talking and philosophizing, and even your energetic discussion, even gathering to express your emotions together, well, it can be good. It is useless if it does not find its context within action in our lives. All of our worship and enthusiasm is empty if it doesn't tangibly demonstrate itself in our lives. In verse 18, James introduces this imaginary character. He says, he's speaking of this, and he says, this opponent shows up and challenges him and says, "You can't see faith. It's not visible. Show me. I know you can't." And James says, "I sure can." He says, "Look at Abraham and how his faith was seen in his actions." We can't necessarily see the heat coming off of a barbecue grill. It's not visible. But boy, we sure can see the effect of it on a big sizzling piece of red meat, right? It's close to barbecue season. You get excited, right? It's spring out there. But he says this, faith and faithfulness are two sides of the very same coin. They are inextricably linked. They cannot exist apart from each other. In verse 22, speaking about Abraham, we read this. He says, "You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did." This Greek term that we translate as made complete is teleo. It literally means maturing. And I think this is fascinating. You see, obviously, Abraham was following God before this moment that they speak of. But what James was saying is that when Abraham took action, when he put his faith into action, his faith was being matured. That is what grew his faith. It was being worked out in his life. He was being stretched. And the point is this, that the event was not his moment of faith, but it was part of the process of the maturing of it. Here's what James is saying. If you claim to have faith, if you claim to be religious, and when James uses the term religious, we have negative connotations. It didn't exist that way. But he says, when you claim to be a Jesus follower, but it's not translating into tangible action, actual change in your life, on what basis can you make that claim, he says? You cannot have a change of heart without it translating into the way that you are living and acting day to day, and how you treat each other. Do you gossip less? Is it something that's noticed about you in the workplace or in your schools? Are you quick to listen and slow to react or speak, even when a situation is difficult? Do you seek to stop and understand what somebody is saying to you? Or are you lashing out in anger, quick to react and harsh in your judgments? Are you driven to be merciful as mercy has been given to you? Do you treat or see people to how they can benefit your life? Or do you see the inherent value in every person and seek to understand their experiences? Do you show favoritism? Do you assess somebody by their outward appearance or maybe their race or their economic status? Or do you treat those that have something to give you back with more attention than others? You see, if our faith is summarized more in sentiment than it is in action, James says there's some real reflecting that needs to happen. Well, that's my gentle way of saying what James put much more bluntly and harshly. The last verse in this passage sums it up really well. It says this in verse 26. He says, "As the body without the spirit, without breath, is dead, so faith without action is dead." And it's interesting to me because the natural comparison I would have would be to equate the body to our actions, because both are more of a tangible physical form, and our faith that's unseen more to the breath of life, to our spirit. And yet this isn't what James does. He flips it around and he says this, "As the body without breath is dead, so there's no life in it." He says, so our faith, like the body, is without life. It is dead without our actions, without our deeds. And I love this. It's a beautiful picture to me because it is only when we engage into action, it's only when we engage into the vulnerabilities of our world around us, it's only when we engage eye to eye with each other in how our faith comes out. When we join with the kingdom, calling of the kingdom of God to move to the needs around us in our world, that our faith gets breathed life into it. That it becomes energized, that it comes alive. The very spirit of our faith is discovered only in action. And how often do we just sit and think, hey, I'll just have a formulaic version of faith where I can do all these, check the boxes, take it in and think the right things and believe the right things, and hey, I'm good to go. And James says, what good is a faith that doesn't work itself into action in our lives? It's not pistis at all. It's not faithfulness at all, James would say. Pistis is our allegiance. It's our ongoing allegiance in our faithfulness. Following a living God. And it finds its context in our lives when we actually follow Jesus. Jesus himself demonstrated his willingness to take action on our behalf, his willingness to make his love and compassion and healing and mercy known in our lives, not simply by sentiment, but by putting his life on the line. By coming into our vulnerabilities and being present with us in them, walking this earth, and taking action on our behalf, ultimately in giving up of his life. It wasn't sentiment. It cost him dearly. And this is what Jesus asks us to follow him in. And so that invitation is open to all to say, let's follow Jesus together, but let's not do it in sentiment. Let us do it in action. Let us actually follow Jesus together. We're going to take a moment together as a community all over at all of our sites to share in communion and to reenact this invitation that Jesus has to say, follow me in what I have done. So I'd like to release the fire hall and the warehouse.